Welcome back, focused learners, to another explainer. I'm really glad you're here today because we're about to unpack one of the most dramatic, pivotal, and honestly deeply consequential moments in all of human history. We're talking about August 1945. On August 15th of that year, Emperor Hirohito got on the radio and made this historic broadcast announcing Japan's surrender, which finally, mercifully brought the horrors of World War II to a close. But how we actually got to that exact moment? Well, it's a story with way more layers than you might realize. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. What really ended the war? For decades, a lot of people believe the answer was simple, right? It was singular. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were what forced Japan to surrender. It's the narrative most of us grew up with. But historians have actually brought forward this fascinating, highly debated counter-narrative. A lot of scholars argue that another massive event, specifically the sudden and totally overwhelming entry of the Soviet Union into the war, was just as important. Some say it was literally the decisive factor. So today, we're going to look really closely at what actually convinced Japan to throw in the towel.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the surrender debate itself. Second, Japan's desperate summer. Then we'll hit Shock 1, the atomic bombs, followed by Shock 2, the Soviet invasion. And finally, we'll wrap up with the emperor's decision. All right, Section 1, the surrender debate, unpacking the historical consensus. Just keep in mind, we're exploring an enduring historical mystery here, not just trying to declare one side right and the other completely wrong. This lays out exactly what historians are weighing right now. On the one hand, you've got the argument for the atomic bombs. The idea is that the absolute, completely unprecedented destructive power of these new weapons just absolutely shocked Japanese leadership into submission. But then, on the other hand, you've got the argument for the Soviet entry. This side emphasizes that the sudden invasion caused a total strategic collapse, suddenly threatening them with an unwinnable two-front war. Our job today is to take a really objective look at both of these monumental events. Moving to Section 2, Japan's desperate summer, the baseline of 1945. Before we look at August, we really need to set the scene and understand exactly where Japan stood strategically. By the summer of 1945, Japan was in a genuinely, absolutely desperate position. Their navy was largely destroyed. American submarines were running a blockade that had completely cut off vital supplies. It was so bad that civilian caloric intake was dropping to literal starvation levels. On top of that, U.S. bombing raids had just devastated major cities, and there was virtually zero fuel left. It was bleak. Yet, despite this crushing, relentless pressure, some of the Japanese leaders were still holding out hope that they could avoid an unconditional surrender and somehow preserve the emperor. So, the crucial question is, how on earth did they plan to achieve a negotiated peace? Well, it all hinged on the 1941 Neutrality Pact. This was a non-aggression agreement between Japan and the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union was still neutral in the Pacific theater, Japanese leadership really clung to this hope that Moscow might act as a mediator between them and the Allies. Basically, this pact was their final, desperate diplomatic lifeline. Now, I really want you to keep your eyes on these dates because the pacing here is just astonishing. August 6th, Hiroshima. Just 2 days later, August 8th, the Soviet declaration of war. The very next day, August 9th, Nagasaki. And then, less than a week later, August 15th, they surrender. This entire sequence, from the dropping of the first bomb to the end of the deadliest conflict in human history, it all unfolded in just 9 days. Let's break down exactly what happened in that incredibly compressed window of time. Section 3. Shock 1, the atomic bombs. Unprecedented destruction. This right here is the first massive catalyst in our timeline.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how it highlights the sheer, incomprehensible scale of what was just introduced to warfare. It truly cannot be overstated. On August 6th, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Just 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed much of Nagasaki. The catastrophic destruction, the immense loss of life, it completely staggered Japanese leaders. These bombings demonstrated a terrifying new reality for them. They were facing a devastating weapon unlike literally anything previously seen in human history.
And for a lot of historians, this right here is the crux of the argument. They point out that these bombs prove that continued resistance wouldn't just mean losing a war. It could lead to the literal, total destruction of the Japanese home islands. The argument here is that this unprecedented threat of total annihilation is what ultimately forced the leadership to wake up and realize surrender was absolutely their only option. All right, Section 4, Shock 2, the Soviet invasion.
the strategic collapse. So, remember that 1941 neutrality pact we talked about earlier, Japan's last hope for a negotiated peace? Well, on August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union suddenly declared war on Japan, officially breaking that pact. Any lingering hope that Japanese leaders had that Moscow could somehow step in and help them negotiate a peace with the Allies, it evaporated completely, literally overnight. Their entire diplomatic strategy just ceased to exist. And the Soviets didn't just declare war, they immediately launched a massive, lightning-fast invasion. We're talking about sending over 1 million troops right into Japanese-held Manchuria. Soviet forces dealt an incredibly swift and decisive defeat to Japan's Kwantung army. This completely turned Japan's strategic situation upside down. Suddenly, the military wasn't just fighting the United States in the Pacific anymore, they were facing the immense power of the Red Army pouring in from the Asian mainland. It was an unwinnable two-front war. Plus, Japanese leaders held some very deep fears about the spread of communist influence, or even a direct Soviet occupation if they kept fighting.
Which brings us to Section 5, the Emperor's Decision, Reaching a Synthesis.
Even with both of these catastrophic shocks happening at basically the same time, Japan's Supreme War Council remained bitterly, stubbornly divided over whether to just keep fighting. It was at this exact moment that Emperor Hirohito took a highly unusual step. He intervened directly to break the deadlock and threw his support behind accepting the Allies' terms. But he had one critical condition. They would surrender provided the imperial institution could be preserved. Now, while this condition was absolutely central, historians haven't actually found any conclusive evidence that Hirohito surrendered primarily out of a personal fear of, say, a Soviet execution. Protecting the institution itself, however, was absolutely paramount.
So, we return to our two historical arguments. Which shock actually pushed the emperor and the divided council to finally surrender? Well, some scholars stand firmly by the atomic bombs, arguing they provided this decisive, overwhelming display of destructive power that just made fighting pointless. Other scholars argue for the Soviet declaration, pointing out that it fundamentally changed the strategic math and wiped out any realistic path to a negotiated settlement. But, when you step back, a lot of modern scholars actually arrive at a synthesis. They say it wasn't strictly one or the other. Instead, it was the paralyzing combined impact of both events, crashing down on them within mere days of each other, that ultimately forced Japan's hand. And it is so important that we understand this. Why? Because the outcome of these few intense days in August 1945 literally built the modern world we live in today. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, he closed the deadliest conflict in human history. But those exact same dramatic events, the deployment of atomic weapons and this incredibly rapid realignment of global superpowers, they also marked the definitive beginning of the nuclear age and perfectly set the stage for the Cold War that was about to follow. So, whether it was the devastating, unprecedented power of the atomic bombings, the complete strategic collapse caused by the Soviet invasion, or the paralyzing combined impact of both, this remains one of the most fascinating, enduring debates in modern history. And now that you've seen the evidence laid out from both sides, I want to leave you with this question to consider. Looking at the timeline and the immense pressures Japan faced, which shock do you think was the truly decisive factor? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.